everybody. My name is William Malek, and I am in Bangkok, Thailand right now, actually with Jonathan, who I'll introduce in a minute. But it's a beautiful, no air pollution day, I think, because we still have significant lockdown going on, but it's now become the city of angels, as it always has been. But I'm very glad that you made it here today. It looks like we have about 32 people right now, so we'll get started. I'd like to welcome you to this session, which is called Collaborate to Innovate, Government Policy Approaches to Harness Innovation During Pandemics. And Jonathan and I had a good 30-minute conversation later this week, just trying to talk a little bit about this subject. And Jonathan is the Chief of Technology and Innovation with the UN, covering most of Asia and the Pacific. And I think we'll have a very illuminating discussion, because as Jonathan and I were talking about, with the pandemic, it's demonstrating just the insane need for cooperation and collaboration in public and private and academia to actually solve this problem and to get through it. And as I think we'll hear from Jonathan, this is just the beginning, and we're going to need to understand how to do this better and faster as the world moves on. So with that, Jonathan, I'm going to turn it over to you. It's start time, and welcome.
Thank you very much, William, and good morning, good evening, good afternoon to all of you, wherever you are in the world. My name is Jonathan Wong. As William mentioned, I'm the Chief of Technology Innovation at the UN, covering the Asia Pacific region. And when I was speaking to the organizers about kind of where we should focus the topic of conversation, of course, COVID-19 came into it, and I'm sure this theme will resonate throughout the whole conference and during many of the sessions. So I'll be touching on that subject, and particularly the need to collaborate on innovation during pandemics. For those of you who don't know, ESCAP is, as William mentioned, the Asia Pacific arm of the UN Secretariat. And just to give you an idea of what I do, because it will kind of make more sense as I go through the presentation, I essentially advise governments on technology and innovation policy. All countries have them in some shape or form. And I work with countries, as William mentioned, across the Asia Pacific region, as far west as Turkey, as far northeast as Russia, as far southeast as the Pacific Islands. I also work a lot with governments on what we call business model innovation. So a lot of work is around how we can support governments to put in place national strategies for things like social enterprise, inclusive business, and impact investing. So a lot of what I'll be saying today will be coming from the perspective of governments in many ways, and how governments can collaborate with different actors such as business, academia, and indeed the public, which I think is really important in innovating our way, shall we say, out of a pandemic situation. So I'll be touching upon that. I'll also be touching upon as well how business could possibly build back better and to be more resilient to future shocks such as pandemics or whatever they may be. And this really relates a lot to the work we do on business model innovation with governments to support things like social enterprise. So that's a kind of a brief intro to what I'll talk about. And let me dive straight in. I mean, the framework I'll use to kind of talk about, if you like, technology innovation deployments in the fight against pandemics will be, to give it a better framing, will be around testing, tracking, and tracing. And I think what's interesting is we've seen around Asia a wealth of different collaborations between government and various actors, certainly around testing. I mean, you look at the Republic of Korea as an example. I mean, the way they've mobilized the technology startups very deliberately in the country to develop new testing technologies has been really quite stark and quite inspiring. And equally, they've done this through enabling policies, such as very innovative things like emergency use approvals. So allowing these startups to go through differing levels of regulatory adherence, shall we say, to not stifle innovation too much and to really accelerate that process of innovation. You'll see around Vietnam's success. I mean, famously has 0 deaths with COVID. I think a lot of the success of Vietnam's response can be attributed to long-term international collaboration as well. It hosts 2 offices of the US Center for Disease Control, and actually has its own version of CDC as well. And this is alongside having a branch of the Oxford University Clinical Research Unit within Vietnam as well. So I think certainly these collaborations around testing with business, with academia, between governments, has really kind of allowed countries to mobilize quickly to develop testing technologies in a very rapid and effective way. In terms of testing and tracing, I think certainly we could talk all day about the numerous apps that have been developed around technology and tracing. But for me, the key thing going forward in terms of collaboration and innovation for governments to consider around testing and tracking is public cooperation and collaboration. There's no question of that. The public needs to be able to understand, trust the technology, and government needs kind of public uptake to actually make these things successful. And of course, the very usual concerns have been thrown up in this conversation. Yeah, this issue of balancing privacy, shall we say, and openness of data is a common topic that is often very controversial still. So for me, there's a big question around actually how do you build trust, and although it's not a innovation topic per se, if we're talking about collaboration on innovation between government and the public, it's the central thing. So how can we build trust between the public and governments for testing and tracking? I mean, we could spend all day talking about this question, but what I think is certainly interesting from the Asia Pacific region is the position the Australian government has taken on all of this. It's making its tracing app very transparent. It explains very, very clearly kind of how the app works, what the benefits of using the app are, what the privacy policy is. It's not one of these kind of Facebook type disclaimers that would take you probably 3 years to read through. It's very clear in that regard. And I think certainly these clear messages and transparency will be absolutely critical in allowing these test and tracing technology apps to get the right level of uptake, to be effective and provide the right information. So that's a really critical partnership between government and public that will certainly be interested to see how that unfolds as things play out. So as I mentioned, a common theme behind these technology deployments by governments is collaboration with business, the public, and other governments as well. And a question that goes through my mind as, again, somebody who advises governments on technology innovation policy is how could we make these collaborations on innovation in the face of pandemics and other such shocks a bit more strategic and deliberate and less about serendipity, shall we say. And to that end, there are a few areas that we focus in on. And I suppose some key questions come up in this regard. I think firstly, I mean, what models would enable effective collaboration between governments and business on innovation in the fight against pandemics? How could governments engage the public to make track and trace technologies work? And in the context of the death of multilateralism, what concepts and models could enable collaborative government responses? I mean, we all read the newspapers every day around the world. Many governments are focusing more on a national agenda, less on a multilateral agenda. You're hearing news of certain governments trying to seek preferential intellectual property rights on a vaccine if they are developed. And these, as a member of the UN and a UN official, and somebody who advocates for government-to-government engagement, certainly on a topic like COVID-19, which absolutely requires government collaboration for a disease that knows no geographical boundaries. How can we go about supporting collaboration between governments when there are kind of some worrying noises coming out, if you like, around different positions governments are taking? So let me start with engaging business. I suppose there's a few ways governments can go about engaging business in the face of pandemics. I suppose one is enforcement. The US, I saw in the news, have the Defense Production Act, which is a hangover from World War II, where the government can actually enforce certain companies to manufacture products like ventilators, etc. So that certainly is one, if you like, policy tool that can support this. But the second one is, of course, to provide incentives, and particularly I mentioned earlier, incentives around promoting more social enterprise, more inclusive business, and more impact investing. And for those of you who don't know much about these concepts, I'm sure many of you do. I suppose these are certainly businesses that aim to make money, which is absolutely fine, but have a social or environmental objective at its heart as well. And I think it's really interesting during the pandemic, we've seen social entrepreneurs rise to the fore, anything from providing online education services to rural communities to edtech solutions across the whole gambit. I think governments can certainly incentivize these businesses that, shall we say, aim to do well as to do good. To give examples, where I live in Thailand, we have a Social Enterprise Act, whereby if you can prove as a business that a social objective is at your heart, although you're looking to make money, you get certain tax reliefs. If you're an investor looking to invest in certain companies, and one of them is a social enterprise, you get 100% tax break. So that's what I mean by these sorts of incentives. Additionally, in the Philippines, they have something called a Inclusive Business Accreditation Act, which essentially means if you can prove that your business is deliberately trying to provide services and products to the very poorest people, you get tax breaks for that. So I think certainly there's things governments can do to develop kind of more socially minded businesses, shall we say, to really kind of provide those incentives to tackle things like pandemics should they arise. I think certainly government should finance innovation in this respect and really, shall we say, kind of direct innovation towards very, very specific objectives. And I'm originally from the UK. UK Innovate has a great scheme which provides SME funding, particularly around COVID technology development, everything from kind of low-cost ventilators to protective equipment across the round. So I think certainly we're hearing a lot of the narrative at the moment around governments needing to save the SMEs because they're the backbone of many economies. But equally, SMEs are an incredible source of innovation. And I think certainly government financing directed very specifically towards an objective can really harness that potential of SMEs to come up with the solutions that we desperately need, particularly in the face of pandemics. I think innovative financing mechanisms as well, I think could be quite interesting to engage business. Of course, many pharmaceutical companies and startups are looking to develop vaccines for COVID. And of course, it makes sense given their business models that they will be looking towards actually ways that they could recoup their investments. And certainly things like advanced market commitments, some of you may know, were used to develop pneumococcal vaccines a few years ago. Now what advanced market commitments do are provide a guarantee to the private sector that a certain bulk at a certain price will be procured if the private sector meets the criteria around the vaccine development. And again, this is a great way, if you like, for governments who may not have that much money to lose on R&D, for want of a better word, to actually incentivize the market to develop certain vaccines, and indeed for the private sector to have some level of assurance that there is a chance that these R&D investments will be recouped. And it's interesting now that previously we were talking about AMCs for pneumonia, and now we're talking about them for COVID. So it's again, I think a very welcome policy move by governments and indeed many philanthropists as well in engaging business in that regard. Now, engaging the public, I think the message is quite simple for me. The policy response is much more difficult. It's all about trust. I think the public to engage in these technologies, especially around tracking and tracing, will be absolutely critical. But for me, it's not an innovation question per se. It's a question around how we build trust, and I'm sure we can spend hours delving into that. So I won't go into too much detail right now. Government to government collaboration, I think, is going to be really important, given that the pandemic response will need to be multilateral. I think if one country slips behind and has a second wave, given the openness of our borders, as they will be coming soon with many of the airlines opening up again, I think this will be critical. And I think it's really interesting. Topics like open science are coming to the fore now. I think it's interesting that the COVID-19 genome the data was released within days versus SARS, which took nearly 5 months. I think certainly around open source, governments helping each other will be critical. I think Singapore has developed a very compelling app called Trace Together, which has informed Australia and indeed Fiji deployments. Now Fiji may not have the technological know-how of Singapore, but they need test and trace technology. So I think really governments open sourcing their technologies to share effective practices, indeed lessons learned will be critical as well. And indeed pooled R&D funding. I think certainly in the Asia-Pacific region, we have some of the most technologically advanced countries in the world, such as Singapore, Japan, Republic of Korea, but some of the most technologically deprived as well. Countries like Myanmar, Laos being examples. And I think certainly pooled R&D funding so that countries can move forward together will be absolutely critical. And it was really encouraging to see for Gavi, who are the Vaccine Alliance based in Geneva, exceeding their targeted pledge with over 8 billion pledged by donors and philanthropists to develop vaccines around this. So I think that's going to be absolutely critical. Just to close, I'm mindful of the time. I've got 5 minutes before I've got to close. I just thought it'd be interesting to touch around these concepts of building back better, more towards impactful, inclusive, and resilient economies. I think certainly what we've seen is that digitally enabled businesses have, of course, fared better than non-digitally enabled businesses throughout COVID. For very obvious reasons. Companies that were set up, if you like, to work from home, companies that had a digital platform where they could still trade goods and services, I think has been really critical. Again, another obvious point is that businesses that have been agile and been able to pivot their business models have been very successful. I mean, we fund a company in Bangladesh that is like an Uber type service that provides kind of, if you like, beauty services to rural communities, and this is really to support women entrepreneurs in Bangladesh. Now they've pivoted to not doing that because they can't, to delivering essential products and services to that. I think certainly there's this opportunity towards building more inclusive and impactful economies. And my take on this is I think certainly business has been, particularly in the Asia-Pacific region, a source of, shall we say, innovation and economic dynamism. I mean, MSMEs count for most of the businesses in the Asia-Pacific region. And it's put money in people's pockets, it's given people jobs to pull people out of poverty. But equally, throughout the industrial revolutions, and technology's played a big part in this, you can see what's happened. Environmental degradation has increased in step with the industrial revolutions. Income inequality is at its highest ever. So I think certainly there's this opportunity for businesses to build back better, to become more social, to become more inclusive in terms of looking after the workers in their supply chains, providing products and services to the very poorest people. And topics I mentioned earlier, I mean, it would be great to see in the future economies, companies looking at having the triple bottom line, if you like, around looking at environmental and social objectives alongside economic return. Because certainly, if there's anything COVID has done, it's put front and center and right in our faces that there is a trade-off between social and economic objectives. It's what all governments are talking about. Governments are looking at actually how, with lockdown procedures as an example, they're having an impact on the economy, but they protect people. Vice versa, if you lock down too much, the economy suffers, but health is maintained. I think these trade-offs are front and center now. And I think certainly if we look towards building back better, maybe thinking more about, and certainly something we promote to governments around how governments can build back better to be more inclusive and to create more social businesses is a policy agenda that's certainly within the UN Asia Pacific we're looking to pursue. William, I'll stop there. I'm 2 minutes under, so I deserve a medal for that. Back over to you.
So we've got some great questions coming in here. If we can, we've got at least 10 more minutes. So here's the first one. What has been the contribution of the UN Innovation Network and its UN accelerators in Asia Pacific region?
I must confess, I don't know. I'm quite new to the UN. For any of you who know about who understand the UN is not one organization per se. It's many different types of organizations covering anywhere from, take example, UNICEF, who deal with children's education, to UNHCR, who deal with refugees to et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So there's many organizations. In terms of accelerators, I mean, certainly I know a little bit about the network, but certainly I think it's signaling within the UN this importance of innovation as a concept and how seriously the UN is taking this. The Secretary General especially has put digital cooperation and innovation at the heart of one UN reform and innovating how we deliver better to support our member states and support governments on the SDGs and actually right now with the pandemic. So if anything, I think it's a very new initiative, a very bold initiative, and let's see how things evolve. I can only hope for the best.
Thank you, Jonathan. Next question. Do you have an overview of these governmental financial incentives to pursue social business innovations?
I am currently writing a report about this, so watch this space. I think certainly it's a really interesting area for me because it's quite a new area of policy making. I always say with economic policy, traditional economic policy, you kind of know your tools and metrics. You can, as an economist within a central bank or a treasury, for example, you can play with the interest rates, you can play with government spending, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You're looking at GDP. But I think certainly with this whole area of social enterprise, impact investing, inclusive business, from a government perspective, policy making and innovation is very much in its infancy. And I have many governments saying to me, I get that social enterprise is really interesting, really important. What should I do? I don't think it's so clear yet because we don't have the evidence. Certainly how I look at it is government can play three roles. One is, if you like, a market participant in providing funding to social enterprise, an example, or indeed opening up their procurement processes to social enterprises. They can be a market regulator in terms of providing certain tax incentives like they do in the UK, in the UK and indeed in Thailand around tax incentives if you meet the criteria to be a social enterprise, or you can be a facilitator in that process. In Malaysia, as an example, we helped them set up a social stock exchange, which is a platform that links, if you like, social purpose organizations with investors who want to invest for the double or triple bottom line, as you say. So long story short, I think Asia certainly is a hotbed for government policy around this area. Watch this space, there'll be more research coming out from my team on this one. But certainly the things we advocate for within governments are to recognize that it's still very early, but continue to experiment and evaluate these policies to develop effective policy frameworks going forward.
Okay, good. And I assume that people will be able to get a hold of that if they,
of course,
get your contact details, everything. All right. Here's another question. What do you think will be essential for human training and development to ensure effective collaboration for inclusive and sustainable innovation solutions in the future? That's a whopper.
Wow.
That's a good one.
It's a big question. Let me just take up a small part of it by giving an example. I think certainly, of course, all of us working in the innovation field, I mean, the fourth industrial revolution, as the narrative around that has been emphatic, the way robots will take our jobs, AI will take over the world, etc. And what I often hear there is this call for more digital skills, which I agree with. However, I also talk about skills for a digital age, and I think this is very different. And now, I would like to think that the next Mark Zuckerberg may have taken an ethics course, as an example. I would like to believe that empathy and philosophy, these sorry, my wife's phone's going off. These sorts of kind of disciplines will be built back into computer science courses. So I think certainly these softer skills around essential human development needs and education requirements will be absolutely critical in my mind for a kind of an inclusive and sustainable evolution of certainly fourth industrial revolution technologies such as AI. There's no question. So I think, long story short, it's about soft skills, and for me, it's not about digital skills, but skills of digital age.
Okay. I've got a question here on how do you build trust? And the background of this question is you can build trust at two levels. One is with the policy-making bodies, for example, the governments, the academics, and to a certain degree, if you can get the privates involved. But the ultimate trust, isn't it in with the population? And how does this all kind of work when you have to have trust almost systemically and to allow everybody to participate it? Because if the trust at the population level isn't there, but it's at the government level, then you have a breakdown. You can see this going on in the US and other places. What's your thought on this, on the trust factor?
I mean, again, these are big, chunky, difficult questions which I don't have the answer to. Now, in terms of, again, just around the example I gave earlier, I think the way Australia have been very transparent around the use of the track and trace app is a very simple example, transparent in the sense of what the data will be used for, in very plain English, and not hidden, like many of the disclaimers on many of the social media platforms we use. So I think certainly that's a key thing. And I think certainly it's not, there's an imperative at the moment on governments for the public to trust them, not just for the votes, but to make this happen as well. So I think certainly, I think that's a separate session in itself, shall we say. I don't have all the answers, but I think certainly transparency for me is the critical thing. And of course, trust is so hard to build that once you, be it a government or a corporate, misplace that trust or abuse that trust in any way, you're back to ground zero. So I think certainly governments, corporates, the public, everyone needs to be very aware of that and cognizant of that. Sometimes it's a one strike and you're out. So and you're back to the start. So yeah. But good question, very difficult question.
Yeah. So we're getting close here. We've got about 3 more minutes. So I'd like to end it with, I don't see any more questions in the queue at this point, but let me ask you this one. So for you and what you do at the United Nations, what's your personal preferred future for the next 12 months? What are you going to be focusing on that you see as purpose-driven and impactful given everything happening?
I think a lot of our focus within UNESCAP at the moment, and we have an intergovernmental meeting where we bring governments together to agree on certain things, shall we say, around technology innovation, is to really push this need for more collaboration between governments with business to really fight the COVID response. It's going to need innovation from every part of society, be it the public, be it business, be it academia. And governments need to be, as I mentioned earlier, more strategic and deliberate in how we engage that and harness that innovation expertise within a country and across the region as well. I think the second thing then is around building back better. And I think there's a real opportunity to rethink how our economy works and look at, if you like, capitalism 2.0, 3.0, whatever we're at now. And really to ensure that, as I mentioned earlier, I think business has been a real source of innovation. There's no question about that. There are question marks around whether it's been good for the environment, question marks around it whether it's been good for social equality with income gaps between rich and the poor, the greatest they've ever been. There's a real opportunity to build that better, to develop more kind of, like, if you like, social-minded businesses, more inclusive businesses. And that, again, is an agenda that we're working towards. And to give you an example, we're working with ASEAN as a region, so a block of 10 countries within Southeast Asia, around what more could the 10 governments do together to develop guidelines around developing more inclusive businesses. That is, businesses that really help out people at the base of the pyramid, don't just focus the very richest people in terms of technology deployments, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So they're the kind of the 2 key things that are on my agenda. Let's see where I get in 12 months' time. I as always, I'm an optimist, so I hope for the best.
Well, Jonathan, that was outstanding. We're right on time, and there's a fairly strict rule during this that we should be done right on time. So I appreciate your effort to give us your vision and your passion, and we hope everything goes well at the UN. And thank you, everybody, for attending. And at this point, we're going to go ahead and sign out. So, Jonathan, we're okay. Good to leave. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Everyone, have a good day. Bye now.
Be well.